Good morning.
Good morning.
You can just call me Jan's brother. I was very proud to be Jan's brother yesterday. Those of you who weren't there, the 20% of your congregation that showed up, just amazing people. Those of us who were there didn't have to do much. Just push a little bit, and you guys did the work. Well, you got started. So my church, the First Unitarian Church of Dallas, sits in the middle of some of the wealthiest and most conservative neighborhoods in Texas. A few weeks ago, CNN reporter Randy Kay interviewed a half dozen women from Dallas who could be neighbors of our church. These middle-aged women were defending the President of the United States, summarily dismissing the latest scandal, hush money for porn stars. The women opened their gathering with a blessing. Then one of them says, with religious certainty, I know that God is the one that ordained Trump to be in this position. This Dallas woman's sentiment, which echoes high-profile conservative Christian ministers who regularly declare that Trump's election was God's will. Liberal Christian blogger John Pavlovitz had this to say in response to evangelicals supporting Trump. Dear white evangelicals, people have had it with you. They recognize the toxic source of your duality. They see that pigmentation and party are your sole deities. They see that you aren't burdened to love the least, or to be agents of compassion, or to care for your Muslim, gay, African, female, or poor neighbors as yourself. They see that you're really interested in just making God in your own ivory image. They recognize this is all about white Republican Jesus, not dark-skinned Jesus of Nazareth. You've gained a Supreme Court seat, a few months with the presidency as a mouthpiece, and the cheap high of temporary power, but you've lost a whole lot more. You've lost any moral high ground or spiritual authority with a generation. You've lost any semblance of Christ-likeness. You've lost the plot. And most of all, you've lost your soul. Whether anyone who needs to hear Pavlovitz's message is listening or not, he raises an important question. Has identity politics co-opted a significant religious movement? If Facebook knows you associate with Unitarian Universalists and maybe lean to the left, chances are you've been shown articles like the one I just read from, chastising those who identify as Christian evangelicals supporting Trump, and you likely saw blistering criticism of those Christians who supported alleged sexual predator Roy Moore in the Alabama Senate race. Would a pro-life Christian support Roy Moore just because they could count on him as a vote against abortion rights, even though he stood accused of abusing children? What theology could hold these dissonant positions? I could go on and on. We could just feast all morning on the plight of evangelical Christians. Smugly believing and glad we are not like them. But religion is at its best when it makes us ask hard questions of ourselves. I so wish the religious right had a monopoly on blurring the lines between seeking justice grounded in theological principle and political expedience. Unfortunately, I'm not so sure. The Pew Research Center is our best source for understanding the religious landscape in America. I have some data points for you this morning to make us think as we explore whether we, Unitarian Universalists, are vulnerable to the same blurring of political and theological lines. 84% of Unitarian Universalists also identify as Democrat. In case you're wondering, yes, 84% Democrat tops any other faith community. So what percentage of evangelicals would you guess are Republican? 80%? How about 56%? Just 56% of evangelicals say they are Republican. 28% identify as Democrat. Compare that to only 14% of UUs who identify as Republican. Can you see our risk? When we criticize evangelical Christians as a group for supporting Trump or Roy Moore or policies we rightly consider to be racist or sexist, what information are we relying on? It seems quite probable that many evangelicals are as troubled as we are by the lack of morality in our politics. How vulnerable to hypocrisy are we as a faith community? After Al Franken announced he would resign his Senate seat, after numerous women came forward alleging he had inappropriately touched them, I was struck by UU women I knew reposting the stories that Franken was set up by the right-wing media and should not be giving up his seat. These were women who I mostly know for their activism in support of women's rights and against misogyny. But here they were, defending Franken, who apparently could not defend himself. Why? For a friendly vote in the Senate? Was there any difference between the apparent abandonment of principle for political expedience by those supporting Franken and those supporting Roy Moore? I'm afraid not much. So which matters most, political results or standing consistently for our principle? Does theology matter? There is a 2015 Abigail Disney documentary called Armor of Light. Anyone seen it? Oh my goodness, it's on Amazon. I recommend it. I watch it and I stop it to quote it. I'm going to quote it this morning, okay? Armor of Light is about an evangelical minister named Rob Shank. For many years, Shank was at the forefront of the anti-abortion movement. He came to fame in 1992 for displaying a preserved fetus at an anti-abortion demonstration in Buffalo, New York. I didn't remember his name, but I do remember the event. Shank founded Faith and Action and the National Clergy Council and states that his mission is to bring evangelical Christianity to the nation's leaders in Washington. In addition to being a leader of the anti-abortion movement, in the mid-1990s, he led something called the 10 Commandments Project, presenting plaques of the commandments to 400 lawmakers in Washington. His insistence that the 10 Commandments inform our political leaders led him in 2003 to stand with the now infamous Roy Moore in protest of the removal of a monument of the commandments outside the Alabama Supreme Court. Lest you're tempted to stop listening to me talk about this preacher, I first watched Armor of Light at my church in Dallas. The documentary shares Shank's crisis of conscience, one of theological proportions. The seeds of the crisis were planted in 1998 when a sniper assassinated Dr. Barnett Slepian, an obstetrician in Buffalo who performed abortions. Reverend Shank says he was stunned that people under his spiritual care could commit such violence in the name of a cause that he saw as being about the sanctity of life. In the years after the murder in Buffalo, Reverend Shank bore witness, as did the rest of us, to increasing gun violence in America. In 2013, a mass shooting at the Washington Navy shipyard in view of Shank's apartment finally drove him to action. There is this temptation to lambaste conservative Christians for their support of what we view as unchristian policies and unworthy politicians. I've been guilty. Armor of Light, however, has given me pause. Had I been introduced to Rob Shank only by his public acts during anti-abortion demonstrations, I would probably not be interested in knowing more about him. But after listening to him tell his story, I now believe that Shank is an evangelical example of the kind of activist we should find admirable whether we agree with him on the issues or not. Like many UUs, Shank calls himself a student of Dietrich Bonhoeffer and believes that one's Christianity must be vigorously expressed through one's relationships and one's actions. Bonhoeffer was a Christian theologian executed by the Third Reich for his role in the Nazi resistance in Germany. Shank is motivated by these words often attributed to Bonhoeffer. Silence in the face of evil is itself evil. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act. These principles guide many justice workers and many Unitarian Universalists. Schenck is most well known for being on one side of the most resilient religious and political issue of the past half-century. Those among us who are fierce advocates of a woman's right to choose what to do with her own body may easily dismiss the other side of this argument as being mired in trying to force a religious belief into the law. However, as the documentary lays it out, how Schenck came to the fight over abortion might give us pause from our sanctimony. Schenck was raised Jewish. Schenck's father collected a scrapbook on the Holocaust, complete with pictures of mass graves. The history of the Holocaust was shared with Schenck and his brother and sisters when he was growing up, and he says it instilled in him a profound belief in the sanctity of every life. As he shares this, it is difficult not to hear our first principle that recognizes the inherent worth and dignity of every person. At the heart of the abortion debate is the legitimate theological question: when does life begin? And there is the finer theological question: how is the agency of a pregnant woman balanced against the interests of the fetus that she carries inside her? I'm not here today to attempt a resolution of the competing moral issues in this debate, but I do want to highlight the importance of our continual search for the moral principles that might guide us. There is so much to unpack here, too, including that we can learn from and even work with those with whom we have profound disagreement on theological and political issues. Armor of Light documents how one of the leading conservative evangelical Christians in the country decided to take on what he saw as an irreconcilable conflict among evangelicals who profess to be pro-life but are also fiercely pro-Second Amendment. Schenck was stunned by how much guns figured into not just the thinking of conservative Christians, but into their spirituality. What is to me the most remarkable drama in this documentary is that Schenck struggles to persuade not congregants, but his fellow ministers that there is a serious theological crisis in their community. As these ministers push back on Schenck's pleas, they sound like paid spokesmen for the NRA. Schenck introduces the gun issue to his minister colleagues by saying, "This is not a question of politics, but the theology, the ethical, the moral. When faith becomes inseparably linked to a political position," Schenck says, "when those lines of distinction become blurred, we become vulnerable to selling our souls." But it gets harder to reconcile these two conflicting positions of being pro-life and what I'm going to call pro-gun. We're trying to hold them together like two opposing magnets, and they're not fitting well. When pastors, preachers, Bible teachers ignore these questions, it creates a vacuum, and other voices fill that vacuum. The NRA has come in on the question of guns and attempted to provide all kinds of ethical and moral commentary on the use of lethal force. Armor of Light documents how Reverend Schenck befriends, is influenced by, and partners with Lucy McBath, whose 17-year-old son Jordan was killed when a man in Florida, irritated by the music being played by Jordan and his friends, shot into the teen's SUV multiple times. Jordan's mother formed an organization called Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America. Lucy McBath concedes she disagrees with Rob Schenck on the issue of a woman's right to choose, but she finds an ally to confront the gun culture. While it is pleasing that a conservative Christian leader is now talking to his followers about the horrors of our gun culture, there is much more to take away from Reverend Schenck's story. First, our very souls are at stake when we abandon our moral and theological values for the sake of kindred politics. Second, in grappling with the most contentious life and death issues, we must constantly attempt to discern the moral and theological issues at stake. Sometimes the answers are not easy. Finally, how do we proceed on this journey? alone, or in the broadest of community? After I started working on this sermon, the Department of Health and Human Services announced the formation of the Division of Conscience and Religious Freedom. The purported purpose of this new initiative is to aid healthcare workers across the country who object on religious grounds to performing certain medical procedures, such as abortion. But the fear is that claims of religious objection may be used to deny even basic medical care to a person whose sexual orientation or gender identity conflicts with the healthcare worker's religious convictions. The action by Trump's HHS has generated a lot of concern among UUs. A friend and UU minister in Baton Rouge, Nathan Ryan, had this to say: "As a pastor, it troubles me greatly, although somewhat ironically, that my religious freedoms are being trampled on by the President's Division of Conscience and Religious Freedom. The God that I know and serve is one that pulls toward compassion and justice. I see God when I see someone's heart changed, or when I see compassion outlive petty revenge or selfishness. When I say I serve God, I mean that I dedicate my life to supporting opportunities for love and justice to thrive amidst eroding theologies that support dangerous status quo bigotries. It is what my religion calls me to do. Any action by the government that is counter to this mission is an infringement on my religious freedom. When the government allows some doctor or nurse to deny a person health care because they find the person morally objectionable, that is a direct affront to my religious freedom. When the government enables a business to deny service to a customer simply because that customer is often at great risk to their own personal safety, being the person God made them to be, that is a direct affront to my religious calling and my religious freedom. Bigotry disguised as pleas for religious freedom is an affront to my religious freedom." Reverend Ryan and many of us are concerned that the new HHS initiative will be employed to deny any and all health care to everyone in the LGBTQ community. Setting aside the cynical politics that may be afoot in today's Washington, UUs take credit for originating the First Amendment protections. Reverend Ryan notes the irony that 2 centuries later we are opposing a government that claims to be protecting religious freedom. But we see standing up for the inherent worth and dignity of every person as requiring us to fight bigotry wherever we see it. We see allowing a health care provider to judge a person as unworthy of care as implicating our theology at its core. And we can be hopeful that many Christians would take to heart the story of the Good Samaritan and agree with us. But what about the devoutly Catholic nurse who believes with all their heart and soul that abortion is a sin? Can a UU, on the one hand, favor the dignity of a pregnant woman's right to choose whether to become a mother and still respect the religious views of a healthcare provider? So long as we are, in fact, considering the dignity of the real human beings on every side of these difficult situations, we may struggle to reach satisfying answers for every possible scenario, but our souls should remain intact. As must be clear by now, the polarization that plagues our politics has infected all of our faith communities as well. We have national religious leaders suddenly explaining away hush money to porn stars. We have ministers turning a blind eye to the repeated national tragedy of mass shootings because allegiance to the Second Amendment seems to have overwhelmed fidelity to the Beatitudes. And we are prone to upholding the equality of all humanity only up to the point that it takes out one of our own. Religious affiliation, like political affiliation or economic status, can produce tribalism, where we defend our own, our flock, at the price of the very principles our faith is built upon. At the extreme, religious institutions fail to protect the most vulnerable of their flock from abuse and violence. The most unspeakable events of our history were all supported by religious people who lost their souls for the sake of their tribe. the genocide of indigenous peoples, slavery, Jim Crow. These things were not only condoned, but carried out by people who attended church regularly, including by Unitarians and Universalists. How these horrors could have happened can only be explained by a failure to live by the very moral principles and values we claim as the foundation of our faith. Progress has been made from the greatest sins of our history. We owe the greatest attention not to the past we can't change, but to how we will live our lives to make the world a better place today and tomorrow. There is a great blurring of the lines between faith and politics as we seek justice for those we see as most in need of our service. I didn't come with the answers, but I hope to generate some questions. How do we seek justice for the oppressed without leaving oppression in our wake? How do we discern where theology ends and political expediency begins? Are we on our own to ponder what are the highest theological principles that should guide us? I hope not. To answer these questions, we need not just political community, but religious community. The ultimate issues at the edges of justice are moral and theological, not political. If we are to keep our souls, we need a vibrant community to walk with us, to sit with us, to pray with us, to create the best path to fulfill our theological principles. May it be so. Amen.